In a quiet, suburban neighborhood, life had a rhythm, a predictable routine that all the residents followed. For one family, this rhythm was rooted in love, resilience, and a sense of security that many take for granted. They lived in a small, neatly kept house with a yard that stretched just far enough to let the sun shine on their little corner of the world. Their daughter, Lily, who had been born with a disability that made her reliant on a wheelchair, was their world. Despite the challenges that came with her condition, Lily was a vibrant soul, radiating a warmth that touched everyone around her. Her laughter echoed through the house, and her curiosity knew no bounds. Her parents, protective and loving, ensured that their home was a safe space, one where she could experience life as fully as possible, even within the constraints of her disability. They believed that the outside world would understand and accept Lily's condition as part of who she was. But they were wrong. The world outside, the one that should have been just as welcoming and kind, turned out to be more hostile than they could have ever imagined. It was a neighborhood like many others, peaceful, close-knit, yet filled with people who held firm beliefs about their rights and their space. Among these residents was Karen, a woman whose idea of propriety stretched beyond what was reasonable. Karen had lived next door for years, a self-appointed authority figure in the neighborhood, someone who made sure everyone followed the rules. She prided herself on maintaining order, but what she considered order was often a rigid, harsh view of what others could or couldn't do. And so she watched, observing the lives of those around her with a critical eye, ready to pass judgment on anyone who didn't conform to her standards. Lily's family had learned to coexist with Karen's watchful eyes. They had even tried to stay out of her way, respecting the invisible line she had drawn around her property. They kept to their routine, knowing full well that Karen was the kind of person who found offense in even the smallest things. But they never imagined that something as innocent as Lily walking down the street, minding her own business, would set off a chain of events that would forever change their lives. One ordinary afternoon, as Lily made her way down the street, her parents oblivious to what was unfolding just a few houses down, Karen was watching from her window. Lily's wheelchair wheels rolled smoothly over the pavement as she passed Karen's house, enjoying the warmth of the sun on her face. She was used to this brief moment of freedom where the world seemed to shrink and the outside world felt just a little bit more welcoming. Karen, however, saw something else entirely. The sight of Lily on her daily walk, moving past her property, was enough to trigger something in her. To Karen, this was not just a simple act of walking, it was an invasion of her space, her peace, her property. What could possibly possess someone to go to such extremes over something so seemingly trivial? How did a simple walk, a harmless, normal activity, spiral into an act of aggression? The conflict that was about to unfold would raise uncomfortable questions about entitlement, boundaries, and the darker sides of human nature. What happened that day would shatter any illusion of peace the family had once held and would leave them questioning the very fabric of their community, their safety, and their trust in those they once considered neighbors. This wasn't just a story of a disabled child being attacked. It was a story of a community that allowed cruelty to fester in the guise of authority. It was a story of a family that was forced to confront the ugly reality that sometimes the world doesn't just tolerate difference, it actively rejects it. And it was a story of resilience, of standing up when everything you hold dear is threatened, when every ounce of hope feels like it's slipping away, but you still fight because your loved ones are worth fighting for. The moment that would define Lily's family was just beginning, and with it, a painful journey they never saw coming. In the days that followed, the tension in the neighborhood began to simmer just beneath the surface. Lily's family, still reeling from the first shock of Karen's strange behavior, tried to keep things as normal as possible. Lily resumed her daily walks, as much as her disability allowed her, feeling the wind on her face and listening to the chirping of birds in the trees. Her parents, unaware of the underlying tension, trusted that things would calm down. But Karen's fixation on Lily grew more intense by the day, as though the simple act of walking past her property had become a personal affront. Karen's obsession with order, control, and the illusion of power that came with her self-imposed authority was beginning to spill over into dangerous territory. It wasn't just about Lily walking by anymore. It was about maintaining her control, asserting her dominion over the small piece of land she had claimed as her own. For Karen, it had become about more than property lines or boundaries. It had become about her ability to dictate the terms of what was acceptable in the neighborhood. And in her eyes, Lily's presence on the sidewalk, in her view, was not acceptable. One afternoon, as Lily made her usual journey down the street, something felt off. The quiet suburban streets, once a peaceful retreat, now felt heavy with a sense of unease. Lily, being a creature of habit, did not sense the growing danger around her. She wheeled herself slowly, carefully as she always did, a smile on her face as she passed the familiar houses and gardens. She didn't know that Karen was once again observing her from her window, her eyes narrowed, her mind spinning with thoughts of control. Lily's simple act of walking past her house had, in Karen's mind, crossed a line, one she was determined to enforce. As Lily approached Karen's property, the door to Karen's house swung open. It wasn't an accidental moment. No, Karen had been waiting for the right time, watching Lily's movements, anticipating when she would pass by again. This time, Karen's face was twisted in a mixture of frustration and self-righteousness. She stood on her porch, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched Lily approach. There was no warm greeting, no casual conversation, just a cold, determined glare that pierced the air like a blade. Lily's eyes moved over the yard, taking in the familiar surroundings, unaware that this time things would be different. She had walked past Karen's house countless times, and until now, it had been uneventful. But Karen, fueled by her irrational sense of entitlement, decided that today was the day she would confront Lily. She would make her presence known. She would teach Lily and her family what she believed was the proper way to exist in her neighborhood. As Lily neared the edge of Karen's property, Karen stepped forward, blocking her path. "You can't just walk here," Karen said, her voice sharp, cutting through the peaceful silence of the afternoon. "This is my property and you're trespassing." Lily, caught off guard, stopped in her tracks. She hadn't crossed any property lines. She was just passing by, as she always did. "I'm not trespassing," Lily replied calmly, trying to maintain her composure despite the rising tension in the air. "I'm just walking on the sidewalk." But Karen wasn't listening. The words that came out of her mouth were laced with hostility. "You don't get to just walk past my property whenever you please. You need to turn around and go the other way." There was an air of entitlement in Karen's voice, a belief that her demands, no matter how unreasonable, should be followed without question. Lily, her heart racing now, struggled to maintain her calm. She hadn't expected this confrontation. She wasn't used to people making her feel like an intruder in her own neighborhood. She had every right to be on the sidewalk. Yet here she was being treated like an unwelcome guest in her own world. "I'm just going home," Lily said, her voice wavering slightly. "I don't want any trouble." But Karen was not interested in hearing Lily's reasons. To her, this was more than just a disagreement over a sidewalk. This was about control, about asserting her authority in a way that would ensure her neighbors knew their place. She took a step closer to Lily, her body language hostile. "I don't care where you're going," Karen snapped. "You're not welcome here. Get off my property." In that moment, Lily's body tensed. She didn't know what to do. She had been caught off guard, and she wasn't prepared for this type of aggression. As Karen moved even closer, Lily instinctively pushed herself back, trying to give herself space. But Karen's anger was not easily dispelled. She stepped forward once more, and her hand shot out, pushing Lily's wheelchair back against the fence. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The force of the push, however small, was enough to make her feel vulnerable and terrified. The quiet suburban street that had once felt like a safe haven now felt like a cage. She was trapped, cornered by someone who believed she had the right to dictate how Lily should exist in her own neighborhood. It wasn't just about a confrontation anymore, it was about power. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Lily's mind raced, her body tensed, but she knew that nothing she said would change Karen's mind. Karen had already made her decision. She was not going to let Lily pass without a confrontation. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as the words she had spoken earlier echoed in her mind. "I'm just walking on the sidewalk." It seemed so simple, so innocent, but to Karen, it was an act of defiance, one she would not let go unanswered. In that instant, as the confrontation reached its peak, Lily realized that things would never be the same again. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a safe place, was no longer the peaceful haven she had known. The tension had escalated, and she now found herself facing the ugly truth that some people, like Karen, saw nothing but threats in those who dared to live differently. The confrontation between Karen and Lily had escalated in a way neither of them could have anticipated. In the quiet stillness of the afternoon, where the world outside seemed to move at its own pace, something had snapped between them. What began as an innocent walk down the street had now turned into a power struggle, with Karen standing her ground and Lily feeling the weight of this unexpected aggression, unsure of how to handle the situation. Karen's eyes burned with an intensity that was hard to ignore. It was as though she was determined to win, to prove something, not just to Lily but to herself. Her words had been sharp, her demands firm. "You don't belong here," she had said, her voice full of authority. Lily, trapped in her wheelchair, tried to shrink away from the growing hostility. But Karen was relentless. The push against Lily's wheelchair had caught her off guard. The jolt had been enough to make her heart race, but it wasn't just the physical force that unsettled her. It was the realization that someone, a neighbor she had never thought twice about, could harbor such contempt for her mere existence. What had she done to deserve this? All she had done was walk by, as she had countless times before. She hadn't trespassed, she hadn't made a scene. But Karen, with all her self-imposed authority, saw her presence as an intrusion. "Please," Lily's voice trembled, a mix of fear and confusion. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I'm just going home." But Karen wasn't listening. She was so wrapped up in her self-righteous indignation that she could no longer see reason. "I told you to leave," Karen snapped. "Now you're pushing it." Lily could feel her pulse pounding in her chest, her breath shallow as Karen loomed closer. The power dynamic was clear. Karen was trying to establish dominance over a situation that never should have escalated this far. Every part of Lily's body screamed for her to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The sidewalk, once a space of freedom, now felt like a trap. Her wheelchair, which she relied on to move through the world, felt like a cage, limiting her ability to escape the confrontation. Karen's grip on the situation tightened. She stepped closer, her voice rising, filled with self-righteous fury. "I'm not going to stand here and let you ruin my neighborhood," she declared, as though Lily's very existence posed a threat to her sense of order. "You can't just walk past like you own the place." The words stung more than the physical push. It was the assumption that Lily, simply by being there, was doing something wrong, something worthy of punishment. It was as though her very presence was an offense, an affront to Karen's idea of how things should be. And in that moment, Lily realized how deep the prejudice ran. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was an attack on her right to live freely, to exist without being judged or harassed. "Please, I just need to get home," Lily repeated, her voice growing softer, more pleading. She was trying to make sense of it all, to get through to Karen, to appeal to some sense of decency. But it was clear that Karen wasn't interested in listening. Her mind was made up. Lily wasn't allowed to walk down this street. Not today, not ever. Karen reached down, grabbing Lily's wheelchair in a way that felt almost predatory. She pushed it back against the fence, the metal clanging sharply. It wasn't just an act of force. It was a deliberate move to assert her control, to remind Lily that she had the power in this moment. Lily, terrified, instinctively tried to push back, but her strength was limited. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheelchair, struggling to gain some semblance of control. The force of Karen's push was not just physical, it was emotional, too. The idea that someone could treat another person like this, so callously, so without regard for their humanity, was almost impossible to process. Lily's mind raced, trying to understand how this had gone so far, how this woman, this neighbor, had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "I don't want any trouble," Lily managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind screamed for her to do something, to make Karen understand how wrong she was, but the fear of escalation kept her rooted to the spot. But Karen was beyond reasoning. She was no longer looking at Lily as a person. She saw her as an obstacle, something that needed to be put in its place. "I'm done talking," Karen snapped, her hand gripping the chair tighter. "Get out of my way." With that, she gave the wheelchair another shove, harder this time, as though she was dismissing Lily entirely, as though she had a right to make her disappear. The force was enough to send Lily's heart into a frantic rhythm, her breath catching in her chest. Her world felt small, confined, as she realized that in this moment there was no escape. There was no way out of this confrontation. She was trapped, not just by the wheelchair, but by a neighbor who saw her as nothing more than a nuisance, a person undeserving of respect or kindness. And then, as quickly as it had started, the confrontation came to an abrupt halt. The air between them was thick with tension, heavy with words unspoken. But Karen stood there, watching Lily with a mix of triumph and disdain. Lily, still processing the shock of what had just happened, could only sit there, trapped in her own thoughts. It was as if her world had just shifted. Suddenly, everything felt unsafe, uncertain. Karen stepped back, a smug expression on her face, as if she had just won something. Lily sat there, still in disbelief. She had never imagined that something as simple as walking down the street could lead to such an intense, dehumanizing encounter. All she wanted was to go home. But now, in the wake of Karen's aggressive display of power, Lily was left with more than just physical discomfort. She was left with the heavy realization that some people would never understand her, never see her for who she truly was, a person deserving of respect, just like anyone else. In the moments that followed, the tension between Karen and Lily did not dissipate. Instead, it thickened, a palpable cloud of aggression hanging in the air. Lily sat frozen in her wheelchair, her body still trembling from the shock of the push. The sting of Karen's harsh words lingered in her ears, a cruel reminder of how quickly things had spiraled into violence. As Karen stood there, watching Lily with a mixture of smug satisfaction and cold indifference, something inside Lily began to break. She had never felt so small, so helpless, and yet she was forced to endure it. Lily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her body tensed with each shallow breath, and the fear that had initially surged through her veins began to settle into something darker, something more akin to anger. She had been a target not just for her disability, but for who she was. In Karen's eyes, she was an inconvenience, an obstacle in the way of the pristine, controlled world she sought to create. But what Lily couldn't understand, what she couldn't accept, was how quickly the line between neighborly disputes and outright cruelty had been crossed. "I've had enough of you," Karen spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just walk by and ignore me? This is my street, my neighborhood, and I will not have it ruined by someone like you." The words were like daggers, each one piercing deeper into Lily's sense of self. The sense of injustice that had been bubbling beneath the surface finally began to rise. How could anyone treat another person like this? How could someone who lived just a few doors down feel such venom towards a disabled child, simply for existing in the same space? Lily knew she couldn't just sit there forever. She needed to find a way out. She needed to go home. But the longer Karen stood there, blocking her way, the more hopeless that escape seemed. The realization dawned on Lily with a heavy weight. Karen wasn't going to let her go. Not until she proved her point, not until she had shown Lily, and perhaps herself, that she had the power to make her feel insignificant. Lily's heart began to race once again, her pulse thumping in her ears. The world around her seemed to blur, her vision narrowing as she focused solely on Karen's looming figure. Karen's body language was clear. She was enjoying this. She was enjoying the power she held over Lily, the vulnerability she had exposed. But What Karen didn't know was that Lily wasn't going to let her have the satisfaction. There was a fire burning within her now, something she hadn't felt in the moments before. Her usual hesitation, her usual politeness in the face of adversity, was being replaced with a fierce determination. No one had the right to treat her like this. No one had the right to make her feel small, not even Karen. With all the strength she could muster, Lily wheeled herself back, just a few inches. The motion was slow, deliberate. She was positioning herself, trying to break free of the invisible cage that Karen had built around her. Her arms trembled as she gripped the wheels, but she refused to give in. She couldn't. Not now. Karen, seeing Lily's attempt to regain control, scoffed. "What do you think you're doing? You don't get to decide when you leave. I'm in charge here." She took a step forward, leaning down with a cold smile on her face. "You're going nowhere until I say so." Lily's hands shook, but she managed to keep her composure. Even as Karen moved closer, her presence more oppressive than ever. The distance between them was closing, and Lily could feel the physical and emotional weight of the confrontation bearing down on her. She knew, deep down, that if this continued, it would only get worse. Her options were limited. She couldn't escape, she couldn't outrun Karen, and she didn't want to escalate the situation further. Just when Lily thought she might be trapped, a glimmer of hope appeared: her phone. The small, seemingly insignificant device sitting in her pocket could be her way out. With a burst of energy, Lily fumbled for the phone, pulling it out and quickly dialing her parents. Her fingers were trembling as she hit the call button, her mind racing as she waited for the connection to be made. Meanwhile, Karen continued to berate her, her words growing more vicious with each passing second. "You think you can just hide behind your phone and make me go away? You think anyone's going to believe you? Nobody cares about you. You're nothing but a nuisance." Lily's throat tightened, but she refused to let Karen's venomous words get the best of her. She knew that she couldn't stay in this situation much longer. Her parents were on their way. She could only hope they would arrive soon enough to diffuse the tension, to end this nightmare that had been forced upon her. But Karen wasn't done. She was determined to break Lily's resolve, to force her into submission. She reached down again, grabbing Lily's wheelchair with an iron grip. "Get out of my way now," she demanded, her voice low and threatening. Lily's heart skipped a beat. In that moment, she knew Karen was willing to go even further than before. She could feel the growing pressure on her chair as Karen attempted to push her back. Every ounce of strength Lily had left was being drained by this battle of wills. The chair rocked slightly, but Lily's grip on the wheels was firm. She wasn't going to let Karen push her around any longer. And then, just as quickly as the tension had escalated, it seemed to pause. Karen stood still for a moment, perhaps realizing that Lily wasn't going to be intimidated, that she wasn't going to back down. But in that brief stillness, Lily could feel the weight of her decision. She had to keep fighting. No matter how strong the force against her, no matter how much fear she felt, she couldn't let Karen win. Not this time. The standoff had reached a breaking point. Would Lily be able to hold her ground, or would Karen's relentless determination force her into a corner? The answer lay in the moments to come. But one thing was clear: this confrontation was far from over, and whatever happened next, Lily wasn't going to be the one who gave up. When Lily's parents arrived, they were met with an overwhelming sense of confusion and disbelief. They had never expected something like this to happen in their quiet, peaceful neighborhood. They had always felt safe walking their daughter through the streets, sure that the community would understand her needs and accept her as she was. But now, as they approached their front door, they were greeted not by the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, but by the heavy silence of a situation that had escalated far beyond anything they could have imagined. Lily sat silently in her wheelchair, her eyes wide with shock. Her body had gone rigid, her hands still gripping the wheels of her chair, as though she could still feel the lingering force of Karen's hands. She hadn't been able to explain the full extent of what had happened, but her parents could see it in her face: the fear, the anger, the hurt. They knew that something had gone terribly wrong. They had never seen Lily so still, so quiet. Her mother rushes to her side, her voice soft and comforting as she tries to reassure her daughter. "Sweetheart, it's going to be okay," she says, her hands trembling as she cups Lily's face. But even as she spoke the words, she could see the tremor in Lily's eyes, the way her lips quivered with suppressed emotion. Something had broken inside her, something that couldn't be easily fixed with a few soothing words. "What happened?" Lily's father asks, his voice stern yet filled with concern. He was a man who prided himself on being strong, dependable, the protector of his family. But now, standing in the face of this inexplicable cruelty, he felt helpless. "Who did this to you?" Lily takes a deep breath, trying to steady herself, trying to find the words to explain the unexplainable. "Karen," she says, her voice barely above a whisper. "She pushed me. She said I was trespassing. She wouldn't let me leave." Her parents exchange glances, their faces hardening with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Karen, the neighbor they had always thought of as nothing more than a quirky, opinionated woman, someone who kept to herself but wasn't outwardly malicious. How could she do something like this? How could she treat their daughter, their flesh and blood, with such cruelty? Lily's mother reaches for the phone, her fingers shaking as she dials the number for the police. She knows that this isn't just a neighborly disagreement anymore, it's assault. It's abuse. The weight of the situation is sinking in now. Their daughter had been pinned to the gate, treated like an animal, like she didn't matter. As the phone rings, Lily's father steps outside to confront Karen. He is seething, his fists clenched at his sides as the adrenaline of the situation takes over. He had always prided himself on keeping a calm, level head. But now, seeing his daughter so terrified, so vulnerable, that calmness evaporates. He knocks on Karen's door, his hand pounding against the wood with an urgency that echoes through the quiet street. When Karen answers, she stands in the doorway with a cool, indifferent expression on her face, as though nothing had happened. Her posture is rigid, her arms crossed over her chest in a defensive stance. "I want to know what happened," Lily's father demands, his voice low but filled with a simmering anger. "What did you do to my daughter?" Karen's eyes flicker for a moment, a brief flash of discomfort crossing her face, but it's quickly replaced by a defensive sneer. "I didn't do anything," she snaps. "Your daughter was trespassing on my property. I told her to leave, and she refused. She's a troublemaker, always causing problems." Lily's father feels his blood boil at her words. Troublemaker? His daughter, who had never hurt anyone, who had always been kind and gentle, was being painted as the villain. He could feel the injustice of it pressing down on him like a weight. He wants to shout, to scream at Karen for what she did. But he knows it won't solve anything. What he needs now is answers, and he needs them quickly. "You don't get to treat her like that," he says, his voice steady but firm. "What you did was assault. You pushed her. You trapped her. You had no right to do that. I'm calling the police, and you're going to answer for what you did." Karen sneers again, but this time there's a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She knows that the situation has gone too far, that she can't just brush it off anymore. But instead of acknowledging her wrongdoing, she doubles down, her voice cold and dismissive. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. It's just a misunderstanding. I was only trying to keep things in order around here." But her words fall flat. There's no hiding behind them. There's no denying the fact that Karen's actions had been nothing short of cruel. Lily's father doesn't waste another moment. He turns to leave, heading back toward the house to join his wife and daughter, his mind already racing with the next steps. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Meanwhile, the police arrive. They take down Lily's account of the incident, the details of Karen's assault, and they begin to investigate. Karen, however, sticks to her story, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. She insists that Lily was the one in the wrong, that she had been forced to act out of self-defense. But the evidence doesn't lie. The bruises on Lily's arms, the marks where Karen had gripped her wheelchair with unrelenting force, they tell a different story. The police take the report seriously, and Karen finds herself facing the consequences of her actions for the first time. But for Lily's family, This was just the beginning of a long, difficult journey. They had been forced to confront not just a violent neighbor, but the ugly reality that some people could harbor such deep hatred for others simply because they were different. And while Karen might face legal repercussions, the emotional scars left on Lily and on her parents would take much longer to heal. As Lily's parents gather around her, offering comfort and support, they know that their fight is far from over. They will stand by their daughter no matter what it takes, and they will make sure that no one, not even Karen, can ever make them feel unsafe again. In the days following the incident, the neighborhood was alive with whispers. News of Karen's confrontation with Lily had spread quickly, and everyone had an opinion. Some neighbors who had long viewed Karen as the neighborhood watch were quick to take her side, dismissing the entire situation as a misunderstanding. They believed Karen was just trying to maintain order, and they couldn't see past her carefully cultivated image as the neighborhood enforcer. For them, Karen was someone who stood for what they saw as the rules of the community, and in their minds, Lily's mere presence on the sidewalk was enough to justify her behavior. But not everyone agreed. A few neighbors who had seen Lily's family around and had always known them to be kind began to question Karen's actions. They knew that the woman who had lived next door for years had always been a bit controlling, but this was different. This wasn't just a quirky neighbor trying to keep things tidy, it was an assault, pure and simple. And for some, it was the first time they'd seen Karen for who she truly was. Lily's parents, despite the emotional toll the situation had taken on them, refused to back down. They had already begun consulting with a lawyer to see what legal actions they could take against Karen. The fear and shock from the initial confrontation had given way to anger, and with that anger came a sense of purpose. They were determined to make sure that this didn't just end with a police report. They wanted justice, and they were willing to fight for it. But in the meantime, they began to see the cracks in the seemingly tight-knit community. As word spread, some neighbors came forward to offer their support, even going so far as to share their own experiences with Karen, moments when they had felt uncomfortable or intimidated by her overbearing nature. Some admitted to having been afraid to speak up in the past, not wanting to be on the receiving end of her wrath. It became clear that Karen had a long history of exerting control over the neighborhood. She had made herself the self-appointed authority figure, the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. She had used her position to bully and belittle others, all while presenting herself as a well-meaning, if overly concerned, neighbor. For years, no one had challenged her, and those who did were often pushed out or made to feel unwelcome. But now, as the truth began to unravel, it became apparent that her actions had not been as benign as they had once seemed. One neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, had known Lily's family for years. She had often waved hello to them as they passed by, but like many others, she had always kept her distance from Karen. When Sarah heard about the incident, she was shocked. She had never witnessed Karen's aggression firsthand, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there had been subtle signs. Karen's obsessive need to control the neighborhood, her constant surveillance of the streets, her overreaction to even the smallest disruptions, all of it now seemed like a pattern that had been ignored for far too long. Sarah decided to take action. She spoke to Lily's parents and offered her support. She told them she had seen Karen act in similar ways towards other neighbors, demanding they move their cars, forcing families to change their plans to fit her idea of what was proper. Sarah had never realized the extent of Karen's behavior until now, but with everything that had happened to Lily, she couldn't stay silent any longer. Word of Sarah's support began to spread, and soon other neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out followed suit. One by one, they came forward, sharing their own stories of Karen's bullying and intimidation. They gave their testimonies to the police, and soon, the truth about Karen's long-standing control over the neighborhood began to emerge. The more that was uncovered, the more it became clear that Lily's case was not an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger pattern of abuse. Despite the growing support for Lily's family, Karen remained defiant. She continued to insist that she had done nothing wrong, that she had only been trying to protect the neighborhood from the threat of Lily's presence. She painted herself as the victim, claiming that her actions had been misinterpreted, that she had been forced to defend her property from someone who didn't know their place. But the more the community rallied behind Lily, the more Karen's defenses crumbled. The police had gathered enough evidence to pursue legal action, and the pressure was mounting. Karen's carefully constructed image of the benevolent neighborhood watchwoman was beginning to crack, and in its place, the reality of who she truly was, a bully with a sense of entitlement, was becoming impossible to ignore. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a safe, quiet place, was now filled with a sense of unease. People who had long avoided conflict were now questioning what had been allowed to happen in their midst. The sense of complacency that had allowed Karen's reign of terror to continue for so long was finally starting to give way to a collective desire for justice. For Lily's family, the support of the community was a bittersweet comfort. They had never imagined that something as simple as walking down the street would lead to such a deep unraveling of their neighborhood's facade. But as the truth about Karen's past actions came to light, they knew that they were no longer just fighting for their own justice. They were fighting for the future of their community. They were standing up against a bully who had hidden behind the guise of authority for too long. In the weeks that followed, as the legal process began to unfold, the community's response continued to grow. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now vocal in their support, showing that they would no longer allow someone like Karen to control the neighborhood. It wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about reclaiming their space, their peace, and their right to live without fear of being targeted. The strength of the community, rising together in the face of adversity, would prove to be the turning point that finally brought Karen to justice. As the legal battle began to unfold, the air around Lily's family felt heavier. The weight of their fight was no longer just about seeking justice for their daughter. It had grown into a full-scale battle against the oppressive authority that Karen had imposed on the neighborhood for so long. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. The case had become more than just a personal dispute. It had become a symbol of what was right and what was wrong in their community. Lily's parents had never imagined they would be in this position. They had always believed in the power of kindness and compromise. They had trusted that the law, the system, would be enough to handle situations like this. But what they quickly learned was that the fight for justice was never as simple as it seemed. They had to navigate a system that often prioritized peace over truth, and they had to confront a community that had long turned a blind eye to Karen's behavior. Karen, on the other hand, was relentless. She had hired a lawyer, a slick, well-known attorney who specialized in property disputes, to help her defend her actions. With her lawyer by her side, Karen presented herself as the aggrieved party. She claimed that she had simply acted out of concern for the safety of the neighborhood, that Lily had been a threat to the order she had worked so hard to maintain. Her defense was full of rehearsed lines about property rights, safety concerns, and a twisted narrative of self-defense. She painted herself as a victim of Lily's reckless behavior, insisting that she had been forced to act in the way she did. The court proceedings were tense. The opposing lawyers fought fiercely, but Lily's family was determined to see this through. Every day, they gathered the pieces of evidence, photographs of Lily's bruises, testimonies from neighbors who had seen Karen's bullying behavior firsthand, and the police reports detailing the assault. As the truth began to unfold in front of the judge, Karen's carefully constructed image began to unravel. But the turning point came when Lily took the stand. Her voice shook as she recounted the events of that afternoon, her hands trembling as she spoke. She described, in painstaking detail, how Karen had pushed her wheelchair into the gate, how she had tried to leave but had been blocked, how Karen had refused to listen when she pleaded for peace. It was a difficult moment for Lily, but it was also a crucial one. Her bravery in recounting her experience, in speaking out against the person who had hurt her, was a powerful statement that would resonate with everyone in the courtroom. Despite the emotional toll it took on her, Lily stood firm. She refused to let the weight of the situation crush her. She knew that the truth was on her side, and she would not back down. Her testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial. The judge, who had listened intently to both sides, now began to see through Karen's facade. The evidence, the witnesses, And now Lily's own words painted a clear picture of a woman who had crossed the line from being a concerned neighbor to a dangerous bully. The judge could no longer ignore the fact that Karen had deliberately escalated the situation and that her actions had caused harm, both physical and emotional, to Lily. As the court proceedings progressed, Karen's defense grew weaker. The holes in her story became more apparent, and her attempts to deflect blame onto Lily only made her appear more desperate. The more the truth came to light, the more it became clear that Karen had been the aggressor and that her need for control had led her to do something unforgivable. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited for the judge's decision. Lily's parents held their breath, their eyes fixed on the judge as he began to speak. The evidence presented in this case is clear. The judge said, his voice steady and authoritative, "Karen, you acted with malice and aggression, and your actions were not only unjustified but also illegal. You violated Lily's rights, and you caused her unnecessary harm. For that, you will be held accountable." It was a moment that felt both surreal and monumental. For Lily's family, the years of uncertainty, the sleepless nights, the constant worry, they were all leading up to this moment. The judge's words brought a wave of relief, but it wasn't just relief, it was validation. The truth had been heard, and justice had been served. Karen's lawyer tried to mount a last-minute defense, but it was futile. The judge made his decision. Karen would be held liable for her actions. She would face charges for assault, and the court ordered her to pay restitution to Lily for the physical and emotional damage she had caused. Lily's family felt a sense of triumph, but it was bittersweet. Yes, they had won the battle, but the emotional scars from this ordeal would take much longer to heal. They knew that this experience had forever changed them. Lily's parents had learned a painful lesson about standing up for what was right, about fighting for justice in a world that didn't always seem to care. But they also learned the importance of community, how their neighbors who had once been silent had now found their voices and stood beside them in their time of need. As the trial ended and the courtroom began to empty, Lily's family left the building together. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning. They had faced a force they never thought they would have to confront, and they had come out stronger on the other side. Lily, though scarred by the experience, held her head high. She knew that her voice mattered, that her story had been heard, and that in the end, it had made a difference. And as they walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, they knew that the community had changed too. They had stood up to injustice, and they had won not just for Lily, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced by fear or power. The road ahead would still be difficult, but at least they could walk it with their heads held high, knowing they had done the right thing. The final weeks after the trial were a mixture of relief and reflection for Lily and her family. The legal battle had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. But now, as the dust began to settle, there was a sense of victory. Not just for them, but for their community. The small, quiet neighborhood they had once called home was forever changed by the events that had unfolded. What had started as a single confrontation between a disabled girl and a neighbor had turned into a turning point for everyone involved. For Lily, the healing process was slow but steady. The physical bruises from the altercation had faded, but the emotional scars would take longer to heal. She had been through something no child should ever have to experience, something that shook her sense of safety and trust in the world around her. But through it all, she had shown incredible strength. Despite the trauma, she had found the courage to speak out, to tell her story, and in doing so, she had given others the strength to do the same. The support from her parents, the community, and even strangers who had heard her story gave her the reassurance she needed to move forward. Her parents, too, were navigating a difficult journey of their own. They had fought tirelessly for their daughter's justice, but the emotional toll of the trial had left its mark on them. They had witnessed firsthand how quickly a seemingly harmless situation could escalate into something far darker. The fear that had gripped them during the weeks of uncertainty was something they would never forget. But in the end, they had won. They had protected their daughter, and they had made sure the world knew that no one no matter how powerful they thought they were, could hurt their child and get away with it. Yet, as the legal proceedings ended and the court's verdict was handed down, there was no real sense of closure. The damage had been done. Karen had been found guilty of assault, and while that brought a sense of justice, it didn't undo the harm she had caused. The emotional scars would take much longer to heal, and there was no simple solution to the trauma that Lily had endured. But for Lily's parents, the most important thing was that they had fought for her, and in the end, she knew that they had always been there for her. That knowledge, that unwavering love and support, would be the foundation for her healing. The neighborhood, too, was changing. In the wake of the trial, there was a noticeable shift in how the residents interacted with one another. The whispers about Karen's behavior became louder, and soon, even those who had once turned a blind eye were forced to confront the truth. Karen, once seen as a figure of authority, was now viewed with suspicion and disdain. Her neighbors no longer felt compelled to follow her strict rules or avoid speaking out. The community that had allowed her to control the streets for so long was now finding its voice. The support Lily's family received from the community was overwhelming. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to stand up to Karen came forward to offer their apologies, their support, and their commitment to making the neighborhood a better place for everyone. They recognized that they had allowed a bully to thrive for too long, and now they were ready to change. Lily's story, though painful, had sparked a conversation about what it means to protect those who are vulnerable, to stand up against injustice, and to ensure that no one feels unsafe in their own community. It was a lesson that, while difficult, needed to be learned. And as the weeks turned into months, Lily's family began to see the fruits of their labor. The neighborhood was no longer a place where people lived in fear of one person's overbearing control. It had become a place where people felt empowered to speak out, to protect one another, and to stand up for what was right. As Lily's parents sat down with her one evening, reflecting on the ordeal, they couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had fought for their daughter, and they had won. They had exposed the darkness that had been lurking in their community, and in doing so, they had helped to create a safer, more compassionate environment for everyone. Lily, though still carrying the weight of the experience, was stronger for it. She had learned that her voice mattered, that her story was important, and that no matter how hard the road was, she would never be silenced again. The experience had shaped them all in ways they hadn't anticipated. It had brought them closer as a family, and it had shown them that, while there would always be obstacles and challenges, they had the power to overcome them. Lily's family had learned that the fight for justice wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. They had learned that standing up for what was right, no matter the cost, was the only way to ensure that the world was a better place for everyone. As they looked ahead, they knew that their journey wasn't over. There would still be moments of doubt, of fear, and of hardship, but they had already proven that they were capable of facing those challenges head-on. The road ahead might not always be smooth, but together as a family and with the support of their community, they were ready to face whatever came their way. And as they looked out at the neighborhood they once called home, they knew that the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the change they had created, in the voices that had been raised, and in the community that had come together to make sure that no one, not even Karen, could ever again bully or harm someone without consequence. They had fought for justice, and in the end, they had won, not just for Lily, but for everyone who had ever felt unheard, unseen, or unsafe. The fight for justice had been long and difficult, but it was far from over. As Lily and her family reflected on the journey they had just endured, they realized that their story was not just theirs to tell, it was a story that needed to be shared, a message that needed to be heard by every person who had ever faced a similar struggle, whether in their own neighborhoods or in the larger world. For Lily, the experience had transformed her. What had once been a small, quiet girl in a wheelchair had become a symbol of resilience, a young woman who had found her voice and used it to demand change. She had learned that standing up for herself was not just a choice, it was a necessity. And with that knowledge came a responsibility. To make sure that the world around her didn't forget what happened, to ensure that no one else had to suffer in silence, as she had. Her parents, too, had been changed. They had been tested in ways they had never imagined. The fear, the uncertainty, the frustration of not knowing how things would turn out had all been part of the process. But through it all, they had learned the true meaning of strength. It wasn't just about winning the legal battle, it was about standing firm in the face of adversity, about believing in what was right, and doing everything in your power to protect those you love. As Lily's family sat down together, their thoughts turned to others who might be in a similar situation. How many other people out there, they wondered, were struggling in silence? How many others had been silenced by fear, by bullying, by the oppressive control of someone like Karen? And how many people, like them, had believed that the system would protect them, only to find that it wasn't as easy as they had hoped? The more they thought about it, the more they realized that the true victory wasn't just in the legal outcome, it was in the message they had sent. A message that said, you matter. Your voice matters. No one has the right to make you feel small, to make you feel unsafe in your own world. You have the right to speak up, to stand your ground, and to demand justice, no matter who stands in your way. And so, the family made a decision. They decided to use their experience to help others. They began speaking at local community meetings, sharing their story, and encouraging others to stand up against injustice, no matter how small or large. They reached out to organizations that advocated for the disabled, for victims of bullying, for anyone who felt oppressed by forces beyond their control. They knew that their story, powerful as it was, could be a catalyst for change, a change that would inspire others to find their voices and fight back against the bullies in their lives. Their message was clear. Justice is not always easy to come by, but it is worth fighting for. You are not alone, and together we can make a difference. As the family worked to spread their message, they were amazed at the response they received. People from all walks of life reached out to them, victims of all kinds of injustices, people who had suffered in silence, and others who had been too afraid to speak out. But they all shared one thing in common. They had been empowered by Lily's story. They had been inspired to stand up for themselves, to fight for their rights, and to demand the respect they deserved. For Lily's family, the road had been long and hard, but the reward was clear. They had helped to inspire a wave of change, a movement of people who were no longer willing to accept abuse, whether from individuals like Karen or from systems that allowed such behavior to thrive. They had shown that it was possible to fight back, to confront injustice, and to come out victorious. As they continued to advocate for those who had no voice, they found that the healing process was not just for Lily, it was for the entire community. They had been through something incredibly painful, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and more determined than ever before. The ordeal had not only transformed their family, but it had also transformed their neighborhood. They had shown that standing up for what's right was the first step in changing the world, one person at a time. And as Lily's family looked toward the future, they knew that they had made a difference. They had proven that justice was worth fighting for, that standing up for yourself was a powerful act of courage, and that no matter how overwhelming the odds, one voice could spark a revolution. So to everyone who had supported them, to every person who had ever felt powerless, to every community that had been torn apart by fear and control, Lily's family had a message. You are not alone. You are strong. And together, we can make this world a better place. Don't be afraid to speak up. Don't be afraid to fight back. Your story matters, and your voice will always be heard. They knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was ongoing, and they were ready to continue it, because for them, it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about making sure that no one would ever have to suffer like Lily had, that no one would ever be silenced again. And with that commitment, they moved forward into the future, knowing that they had made their mark and that their fight for justice had just begun.